Where does Daniel fit in the canon? The word canon refers to the books of the Bible, all the books of the Bible. And it's among the prophets in the Christian Bible, in the Christian canon. It's among the writings in the Hebrew canon. The Old Testament is divided into three sections: the law, Torah, the prophets, Nevi'im, and the writings, Ketuvim, to use the Hebrew terms. So why is the book of Daniel among the prophets in the Christian Bible and among the writings in the Hebrew Bible? So the writings would be books like Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. The Hebrew Bible puts the book of Ruth in among the writings. The answer to that question has to do with what kind of writing is the book of Daniel? What literary type is it? And that's part of what we're going to have to get at this evening. Is there any place else where Daniel is mentioned? And the answer is yes. So let's look at these. In Ezekiel, Daniel is referred to as a person. In Matthew 24, Daniel is the prophet, but primarily a prophecy from the book of Daniel. So let's look at Ezekiel chapter 14. Ezekiel is right in front of Daniel.
I think.
Ezekiel chapter 14, verses 13 and 14, just to get a little bit of the context. I'm using the Common English Bible, and it starts with human one. That really, is a more literal translation is Son of Man. Suppose a land sins against me by acting faithlessly, so that I use my power against it, break off its food supply, let famine run rampant, and eliminate both humans and animals. If these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, lived there, their lives alone would be saved because they were righteous. This is what the Lord says. A reference to Daniel as a righteous man up there with Noah, and Job. Now look in the same chapter, verses 19 and 20. Repetition, really, with a little bit of variation. Suppose I send a plague against that land and pour out my fury on it with great bloodshed. I would eliminate both humans and animals. If Noah, Daniel, and Job lived there, as surely as I live, proclaims the Lord God, they wouldn't be able to rescue either sons or daughters. These are, of course, words of impending judgment from Yahweh, the Lord God. But here Daniel is mentioned as a kind of model, a paradigm of faithfulness. And of course, Israel, God's people, are not being faithful, and they're in some trouble. Okay, let's go to Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 3. Better start with verse 1. The Lord's word came to me, human one, I don't like that, son of man. Say to the prince of Tyre. Okay, so we have to think about where Tyre is. Tyre is outside Israel. Tyre is in Phoenicia. It's up on the northwest coast, up above Galilee. So the prince of Tyre, say to the prince of Tyre, the Lord God proclaims, in your arrogance you say, I am God, and as God I rule the sea. Though you claim to have the mind of a God, this is back to God speaking now. Though you claim to have the mind of a God, you are mortal, not divine. You are certainly wiser than Daniel. No secrets are hidden from you. A little bit of sarcasm there, right? But again, Daniel is mentioned as a kind of paradigm of wisdom, insight, understanding. So we would get the impression right away that Daniel is a real person. As the Bible's talking about Daniel as a real person, but it's a live question among the scholars whether or not Daniel is a historical person or a kind of composite person made up of perhaps different historical people. And so this is why you get, when you read about the book of Daniel, you're going to get a significant range of scholarly conclusions about how to read this book. And of course, this plays into how we read the book of Daniel today. And I'll just put the big issue on the table, and that is the probably the most popular or the most common reading of the book of Daniel is related to a way of thinking about end times scenarios that involves the rapture and these kinds of things. It's a particular reading of Daniel. And so quite a few people have the idea that the way to understand the biblical understanding of Daniel is to think about these end time scenarios in that particular way. And everything then in the book of Daniel has to be historical by that reading. It's got to be historical. Well, you just get, I'm not trying to overcomplicate this. I'm just telling you that this is a book where scholars, for a wide range of different reasons, don't have clear consensus about how we understand the book of Daniel. So let's go on to Matthew now. And I'll try to get back to that point and at least partially answer the question. You know, the scholars that I think on the whole are the best ones to follow. I'll give what I think is their conclusion about that question in just a moment. But let's go to Matthew 24, verses 15 and 16 again. When you see the disgusting and destructive thing that Daniel talked about standing in the holy place, your Bible may say the abomination of desolations or something really close to that. The reader should understand this. Then those in Judea must escape to the mountains. Those on the roof shouldn't come down to grab things from their houses, and so on. Okay, so there is Jesus referring to something that we find in the book of Daniel about the abomination of desolations. And this reference point, that abomination of desolations, plays into one of the ways that scholars try to figure out what's the historical framework of the book of Daniel. But we now have exhausted all the places in the Bible other than the book of Daniel, where Daniel is mentioned. And in the case of Ezekiel, that's also during the Babylonian exile period. So it's in the early to middle 500s BC. That's a reference to a person. And there's an alternate spelling here. So again, that leads into other theories far beyond what we can do in this study, but that's it. Now we're going to read about Daniel in the book of Daniel, and we have all these historical references to Nebuchadnezzar and kings and empires that we know did exist. The question is, did a Daniel like mentioned in the book of Daniel exist within the empire of Babylon, and did he do the things that the book says he did? There's no source anywhere. There's no court record. There's no official document of any kind that would allow us to say, yep, Daniel lived and he was in the king's court and he did these things. There's just nothing like that. So then this opens up all kinds of other questions about how do we figure out who Daniel is? And one of the ways they do that is by looking at the kind of literature that is the book of Daniel. So we circle back around to where we started with, where it winds up in the canon. And I'll have more to say about the kind of literature we're going to be reading. So, chapters 1 through 6 we get the stories of Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or as we know them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these stories are all about, living in Babylon and being under Babylonian control. Not really suffering exactly, although there are episodes, but according to the stories, they're in prominent positions within the Babylonian government. Then chapter 7, and I set it off by itself because in the layout of the book of Daniel, chapter 7 is kind of a bridge chapter. It has characteristics that make it go with 1 through 6. It has characteristics that make it go with 8 through 12. So I'm going to set it apart there because it is a kind of a pivotal chapter in the book. And this is where we find a vision of God's sovereignty and the Son of Man. So this one like a Son of Man goes up to the Ancient of Days and receives an eternal kingdom and all that. And that's a major sort of conclusion of the book of Daniel. And then 8 through 12 reads entirely differently than 1 through 6. 8 through 12 is all these visions that Daniel has, and he can interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He can't interpret his own dream. So he's troubled, he's distraught. He needs angelic visitation to come and explain these things to him. So what we get in 8 through 12 then is what is known as apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic refers to unveiling, revelation. It's like the book of Revelation. And those of you that have studied Revelation may remember that the book of Daniel comes up a lot in the study of the book of Revelation. So apocalyptic literature is really about God's final victory over all the forces arrayed against God and God's people. Apocalyptic literature uses very dramatic symbols and images. They're often very violent. Everything is exaggerated in apocalyptic literature. Now, by comparison, Daniel, the writing in Daniel is not that extreme, but still we're going to get into some things where it's more like apocalyptic literature than anything else. Okay, I want to stop there and just see if anybody has a question or a comment.
I have a comment. The reason I think that it's in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible is because they didn't have the last book of the Christian Bible.
Aha, can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I'm trying to think of the name of those Revelations. That they didn't, being a Hebrew Bible, they didn't have the Christian Revelations.
Right. So not the full story yet. Yeah. But one of the interesting things about the book of Daniel is that, and that's chapter 7. So a messianic figure appears in the book of Daniel. And then in the New Testament period, we see the apostolic generation. We see Jesus' original followers making that connection. And of course, from a Christian point of view, it's not just they thought this up. It's that, the Spirit of God helped them come to that conclusion and make that connection to see that what was envisioned in the book of Daniel is now fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Good. Any other thoughts or questions?
I had a question about whether Daniel actually existed or not. We've read in there in Ezekiel that he was mentioned along with Noah and Job, who are also not necessarily actual characters. So, does it really matter? I mean, the fact that you mentioned that they're not mentioned at all in any of the the works that we have of the records that we have of any of those empires that existed during the time when he supposedly lived.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, and this is, that observation leads to the question, and we will look at this question. What then are we supposed to do with the book of Daniel? How do we understand what it's conveying to us? Does it have to be rooted in a clearly identifiable historical set of circumstances and people? And, you know, I think the answer that Larry's implying here is no, it doesn't have to be, that it's valuable, it's divinely revealed and inspired for other reasons than telling
Yeah.
us, you know, this happened and this happened and this happened.
Right. It's, to me, it's like historical fiction. You know, it took place in history, but whether it actually, you know, took place exactly, I mean, it doesn't matter to me. I think that the stories stand for themselves, but placing it in history is important.
Yes, and I took this out of an earlier version of this, my PowerPoint, but since you said that, I'll go ahead and mention it anyway. I think maybe a good example of something that we recognize and are pretty familiar with now is if you've ever gone to a movie that's based on a true story.
Right.
So the screenplay, the script has some basis in fact.
Right.
But really, most of the storyline is fictionalized. It's made up. And I was thinking of, I rewatched this movie maybe about a month ago. The movie Hidden Figures.
Mm.
Have you seen Hidden Figures?
Mhm.
Oh, it's a great movie. You should go see it. And it's based on the three main characters in it were real people who worked for NASA. Three African-American
Oh,
women.
yeah.
Who were mathematicians. One of them was an early early leader in the field of computer science and all that. And you know, so the story Hidden Figures is based in three actual historical people, but the storyline we see in Hidden Figures is much of it is fictionalized. You know, it follows kind of the broad contours of their lives, but it's a lot more. And so one scholar that I'm following probably the closest in this little study says something like that it's very plausible, even though we don't have official records that would prove it. It's very plausible that Daniel was an actual historical person. It's plausible that these four Jewish young men were recruited and trained to work in the king's government, Nebuchadnezzar's government. That's all. There's nothing outlandish about that idea. That's quite possible. So I tend to think these are actual people and stories about them subsequent to their lives, because they were faithful. They became important figures for subsequent generations to talk about. And then as we get into more of this material tonight, we'll see how it gets added to and embellished. But that does mean that some of what we read later in the book of Daniel, chapter 8 and following, is not necessarily, I'm trying to be careful here, it's not necessarily from Daniel himself. It may be somebody writing in the name of Daniel, which was also known to happen, a kind of a common feature of writing. And there's a technical term for it, which that doesn't matter, but maybe somebody is using Daniel's name and reputation as a way of conveying these visions. But we'll get back to that.
How did this come to be about? This book chosen to be put in the Bible, how did it come about?
That's a really good question. How did this book wind up in the Bible? Is that the, yeah,
Who put it together?
there's, how the Bible came together, there's no official decision by some authorized body to say this list of books go in the Bible and these other books don't. It happened mainly by usage and custom and consensus about the value of certain books over other books. There is something known as the Council of Jamnia, which was a group of Jewish scholars who, and again, scholars who write about this stuff disagree about how far we should take this idea. But the Council of Jamnia, by that time, which is in the late 1st century AD, these Jewish scholars put the 3 divisions of the Old Testament together and said, this is our canon. So the Torah, the books of prophets, and the writings, all of those books are part of what we recognize as our Bible. For the New Testament, a similar kind of, distribution and usage and this kind of consensus develops over time that these are the books that really communicate what we need to know about the gospel and the Christian life. And some of these other books that we can regard as helpful and useful, they don't rise to the same level. But I know I'm going further than where this session is, but we don't get all 27 books of the New Testament listed in one place until the 300s. And it's in a letter written by Athanasius. But he lists the 27 books of the New Testament as these are the books we recognize as authoritative. So, yeah,
Wouldn't Jesus's reference to Daniel lend some validity to the book?
absolutely it
Because
did.
he's-
Absolutely it did, yeah. But see, by that time, by the time of Jesus' earthly life, Daniel was already widely read and regarded in the Jewish community. Yeah, so in one sense, he's sort of showing his own formation there, having grown up with these kinds of books. Yeah.
We know that Nebuchadnezzar was king of Babylon.
Right,
And in here it says somewhere during the first year of his reign, all this happened and so on and so forth.
yeah,
To me, if that's just literature, I'm not sure they would be that specific.
right,
Then somewhere towards the end of our reading for today, they talk about King Cyrus, which I'm not that familiar with. King
Yeah.
Cyrus,
right,
and he was still living at that point.
right,
So there's 2 historical figures
yeah,
that was in his lifespan.
right,
And if it was, again, just literature, you gotta pull a lot of straws out of the air to say this is fictional and not historic.
yeah, so that's a good point, so, but could we say it's a combination of historical and then it's been added to? And the reason I'm about to get to why scholars think there's other material added that isn't, that we can't say this comes from Daniel because he couldn't have lived that long, right? But even there's a question. Let me get through this and I'll see if I've satisfied anything there or if I just made it worse. How do we date the book of Daniel? Now we're talking about the biblical book. When was it composed? When did it come into being as the book we now have? Now let's keep in mind that all the biblical books rely on earlier sources. So what I'm now saying is, in general, we could say about most of the books in the Bible, particularly these Old Testament histories and things like that. Okay. The 160s BC or BCE, so before the Common Era or before Christ. It's not a consensus, but the most scholars who study this, so the experts that I'm leaning on, say that there are references in the book of Daniel, particularly in those vision chapters 8 through 12, that are that the descriptions are close enough to a period of time in the 160s as to be evidence that these books are dealing with the 2nd century and not Daniel's time in the 6th century. And that's why, I asked the question, why here? So hang with me for a second. It has to do with the accuracy of the description of future events. So let's look at these events. So Daniel 8, verse 9. And there's kind of a cumulative effect here. So we'll sort of withhold judgment until we get to the end of looking at these verses. Daniel 8, verse 9. Yeah, I'm always, I'll interrupt myself here. I'm always a little concerned about this. I don't want to give the impression that because of what I'm saying about literary type, that I somehow think this part of the Bible is less important or less authoritative. I don't think that at all. I think all of the Bible is authoritative, and yet I'm trying to deal with how the Bible presents itself to us, and there are these, shall we call them, complicating factors. Okay, Daniel 8, verse 9. Let's just start with verse 8. I always hate to, we always need a little bit of the context. What we have here is a vision, and as you can see at the beginning of the chapter, it comes in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar, who's the son of Nebuchadnezzar. So it's still a Babylonian king. About a ram and a goat, okay? The he-goat became even greater, that's verse 8, but at the height of its power, its large horn snapped. Now, the Bible uses the symbol of the horn as a symbol of power. So the snapping off of the horn suggests the loss of power. So we're going to look behind the image of a ram or a goat. And what we're talking about is a kingdom, an empire that loses its power. In its place, 4 horns, each a sight to see, came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Here you can get some of this symbolic language that we find in apocalyptic literature. So now the writer is really depending on us not to take him too literalistically here, where we start, the 4 winds from heaven. That there's a kind of comprehensiveness. There's a global aspect to this. It's big, it's exaggerated, not meant to be thought of literally as a wind that's shifting around. A single, very small horn came out of one of the 4 horns. It grew bigger and bigger, stretching toward the south, the east, and the beautiful country. Okay, so it's very symbolic, and yet we're talking about historical events. There's a kingdom that comes to an end, out of which are 4 kingdoms, and one of those 4 rises up, right? Okay, let's go on to chapter 9. Oh, sorry, verses 12 through 14, excuse me. In that same chapter 8. In an act of rebellion, another force will take control of the daily sacrifice. It will throw truth to the ground and will succeed in everything it does. I then heard a certain Holy One speaking. Again, there's that apocalyptic kind of, who's the Holy One? Who is this person? We don't really know, and we don't need to know. The Holy One represents, this is like the divine voice giving guidance. A Holy One speaking. A second Holy One said to the first one, how long will this vision last? The one concerning the daily sacrifice, the desolating rebellion. and the handing over of the sanctuary and its forces to be trampled. He said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be stored. So the number, what does the number mean? Now, scholars look at these verses. Well, let's go ahead and do 927. I'm sorry. Keep getting ahead of myself. Chapter 9:27. For 1 week, he will make a strong covenant with many people. For a half week, he will stop both sacrifices and offerings. In their place will be the desolating monstrosities until the decreed destruction sweeps over the devastator. Now, these references to sacrifices and offerings. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar had the temple destroyed. He had some of the utensils of the temple taken to Babylon. He did not stop the sacrifices. He did not desolate the temple with defiling it with other things. So these verses that we're reading suggest somebody stopped the Jews from their morning and evening sacrifice. Somebody did something to the holy place that even though it's been torn down, it's not the building that we think of, even though it's been torn down, somebody comes along and defiles it, this desolating monstrosity, the abomination of desolation. Antiochus IV, known also as Epiphanes, so God manifest, was one of the rulers of the 4 kingdoms. So think back to the 4 horns, right? One of the kingdoms, he did those things. He stopped the Jews from having the morning and evening sacrifice. He did desolate the holy place. He set up pagan images inside the temple in the holy place. He is reputed to have poured pig's blood where the altar stood and some things like that. So he did do that. So when scholars read all these details, they say, well, that description comes the closest to matching Antiochus, or Antiochus, as some people say. Okay, that's why they think, okay, the descriptions in chapters 8 through 12 are specific enough and precise enough. It's as if this person now writing in the name of Daniel is talking about realities that they themselves are aware of in the present, maybe even that they witnessed, right? Or if they didn't witness it, the word got to them. So this is one way, among a number of that I could name, one way that scholars have come to the conclusion that a portion of the book of Daniel has as a reference point these historical circumstances in the 2nd century. Okay, so for Daniel to write with that degree of specificity, either God is revealing to him that degree of specificity, or somebody is writing in the name of Daniel at a later time, and this material is being incorporated with earlier stories about a heroic figure named Daniel, who is the picture of faithfulness, right? Now, this is not, this raises all kinds of questions, I realize, but it is, what I'm trying to do is, in a nutshell, give you the kind of, the work that scholars do to try to come to these kinds of conclusions. And so just let me repeat that the reason Antiochus IV is understood to be the reference point in these verses in Daniel 8 and 9 is because he fits the description of what's going on in those verses better than any of the other conquering kings. Okay, I'll stop there. Questions? Comments?
Well, so, and I'm not meaning to be argumentative at all, but to assume this is written later 500, 400, 300 years later, then that assumes that it is not prophecy.
It's not prediction,
Yeah.
You're right.
not prediction. And I would say they're not assuming. Scholars go into this, you know, sort of. Again, this is a little bit loose, but sort of like with a blank slate or like a detective trying to figure out what these clues mean. Like when you read the verses that we've read, they ask the question, okay, who fits the description the best? Well, it's not Nebuchadnezzar. So, you know, that's the time of Daniel. It's not, he didn't do those things. So far as anyone knows, there's no indication that he did those things, but they do know that Antiochus did those things that match what the book of Daniel says there. So it's more like ask the question and then the answer that fits the evidence the best is, yeah, it's later. Now, your point is still right. So they're also the scholars who they're not all that keen about predictive prophecy. They're more inclined to see it later anyway. But even scholars who are very okay, shall I say, with the notion that God reveals and people can predict. Even those scholars, many of them, like the one I'm following the closest, regard this part of Daniel as coming from the 2nd century because it does match with Antiochus IV as well as it does, and it doesn't match the others. But there's more to the story. So I'll keep going here. Any other?
Pastor Steve,
Yeah.
how long were the Hebrews in Babylon? 70 years.
70 years. With some
What
state-
you're talking about now, 400 years later, the Jews were already back.
Not all of it.
That's true. Some of them stayed,
Yeah,
but quite a few of them went back home.
they did. They did. Yeah.
So, okay, then I don't remember this part about Antiochus or however you pronounce it. That all happened then after they went back,
Long after. Yeah.
and they then also then conquered the Jews, the Hebrews, and then also made them slaves too.
I wouldn't say slaves. I mean, so after the exile, and by the way, Daniel, in the book of Daniel, we have a reference to the prophet Jeremiah, and this 70-year exile figures in, right? It figures into helping Daniel understand the vision that he's had. But when they did return, a lot of Jews actually stayed in the dispersion because, you know, 2 or 3 generations, you've kind of settled down there, you've had families, you've married in with the neighbors, you've kind of established yourself. So what we have after the exile is we have Jewish communities that are dispersed, and they continue to be dispersed. Some are in Egypt, some wind up in Rome, you know, they're just all around now. Some go back and reestablish the nation and rebuild the temple and all that. But the larger kind of historical picture, let's go back to Daniel 8 and look at verses 21 and 22.
I'm sorry.
8, 21 and 22. The long-haired he-goat is the king of Greece. That's a very specific reference. The king of Greece. And the big horn between its eyes is the first king. So again, we have, this is apocalyptic imagery. So a goat with a horn right in the middle of his forehead and long hair. But we're talking about the king of Greece. The horn that snapped so that the 4 came up in its place means that 4 kingdoms will come from one nation. Okay, looking at my list here, this is exactly what we get. Alexander the Great, again, scholars are going, okay, who's the king of Greece? Best answer, not not close down all other arguments answer, but the best answer is Alexander the Great is the king of Greece. So that's, you see his death date there. He died in 323 BCE or BC. And there were 4 kingdoms that came out of his empire. So I'm going to move up a slide and then we'll come back. I did all these cute things and I don't want to spoil it, so we'll come back to that. Let me move this up out of the way for the moment. Okay, Macedonia on the upper left in green. That's the original kingdom, right? Philip II was Alexander's father. That green area was basically his kingdom. The orange color is Thracia. That's one of the 4. Then this yellow is huge. This is the Seleucid kingdom. Seleucus was a general. All of these kingdoms were started after Alexander died, and all of these kingdoms were originally military commanders under Alexander. But the Seleucid kingdom is huge. It goes over basically to India. Okay? And you can see it covers the Holy Land, right? It also covers Babylonia, right? At this period of time with the Seleucid kingdom, we're long past the Babylonian kingdom. So we go Babylon, then we go Persia, that's King Cyrus, Darius, the King Darius. Then we go Alexander, the Greek or Hellenistic reign. Darius, the king of Persia, is defeated by Alexander at the Battle of Granicus. And that's when Alexander's empire really starts to spread. So if you look in the bottom of the yellow, sort of to the left of the center, you see Babylonia there. You see Susa there. These are obviously mentioned in the scriptures. Susa was the Persian capital. But after Persia, we have Alexander the Great, and then we have these 4 kingdoms. All right. So the Ptolemaic kingdom, that's Egypt, the area of Egypt. The Seleucid kingdom, which I've been talking about, Macedon and Thracia, as I mentioned. So again, historians look at those verses in Daniel and they say, okay, what do we know of history that fits the best with that description? And the 1 king and then the 4 kingdoms out of that seems to fit the best with Alexander the Great and these successor nations. So that pushes us again back into the 2nd century. All right. What about Rome? So, plenty of Christians very early in the Christian era thought Daniel was talking about Rome. That's possible. No,
Should be banned. I mean, the same thing happened. I mean, the abomination which causes desolation happened then. Again, it happened in 67 AD.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'll try to sort of fill out that point a little bit later. So one thing to keep in mind is that all through the history of the church, the book of Daniel has been read in relation to events that are happening in their own period of time. Like if you think about Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth, okay, he read end time scenarios in light of the Soviet Union, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A later generation, now we kind of have the Muslim world in our sights, right? So there is a tendency to read this apocalyptic literature in light of what we see happening in our own time frame that kind of fit with what these books describe. And that's a real thing, right? There's a reason people do that? Can prophecy be that accurate? Yes.
Mhm.
It can be that accurate. There's no question that God can reveal. Again, the questions come up here, but there's no doubt that God is able to reveal to people before the fact something that's going to happen. We have plenty of predictive prophecy in the Bible. Jesus prophesies that Jerusalem will be destroyed and the temple will be torn down. Okay? So I'm just trying to acknowledge the complexity of these questions, right? And there's no doubt in my mind that prophecy can be that active and be predictive. It's happening in advance of the events themselves.
And that's
The
easy to
question
see
is-
that then that Daniel is befuddled, right? That the fact that these things happen so far in the future, he has absolutely no frame of reference for any of that stuff. And yet the way they tie it in is saying that the angel tells them to, seal the scroll and don't show it until many years later. So even Alexander was about 200 years after the life of Daniel
Yeah,
in Babylonia.
right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So then what kind of conclusions can we draw then about specific end time scenarios? That's part of the issue that's kind of working in the background here. And one final question I have. This is the major motif, you might say, for the book of Daniel. It emphasizes God's sovereignty over the nations. Whatever period of time we're talking about, good times or bad times, God is sovereign over the nations. So this ruler rises up and he's an evil ruler. Well, God isn't mocked. It's not the end of the story. Sooner or later, that ruler's going to fall because God is greater than any ruler. And we, God's people, are supposed to stay faithful. This is where we start to get into the actual subject matter of the book of Daniel. These Jewish men in the first chapter don't want to defile themselves with the king's food. Here's an example of faithfulness, right? They're going to stick to their identity, who they are and who do they belong to. So Daniel, the book, is really, its major message is stay faithful because God still is in charge of things. Circumstances can come and go. They can be good and bad. They can be pleasant. They can be very difficult. God is still in charge of things. Okay, now, let's look at the structure of the book of Daniel. Now, I find this stuff really fascinating, and I hope it's not too much. But again, we're not yet talking about the material, the content that's being communicated. What we're talking about is how it's being communicated. And I just find frankly, the brilliance of the Bible writers showing up in points like this. So here we have chapter 1, which is the setting. Chapter 1 is written in the Hebrew language. Chapters 2 through 7, as you will see, are written in the Aramaic language. That's the language that the Babylonians would have spoken, right? Aramaic is a cousin, you might say, of Hebrew. It was the official imperial language. Then chapters 8 through 12 of Daniel are written in Hebrew again. So what's that about? That's scholars are trying to figure that one out too. Okay. Chapter 2, written in Aramaic, is about Nebuchadnezzar's dream and Daniel's interpretation. And here we get 4 kingdoms. Okay. Chapter 3, also in Aramaic, is about God's deliverance of the 3 men from the fiery furnace. Chapter 4, also written in Aramaic, is the story about God humbling Nebuchadnezzar, right? Nebuchadnezzar lives like an animal for a while. Chapter 5 in Aramaic. God humbles Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's son. He gets assassinated, so that's really, really humbling. But notice now, there's a kind of parallel linkage. Chapter 4, chapter 5. Here we have a sovereign God humbling these powerful rulers. Chapter 6, we have God's delivering Daniel from the lion in the lion's den. So you can see chapter 3 and chapter 6 kind of have this parallel theme to them. In chapter 3, it's the three men in the fiery furnace. In chapter 6, it's Daniel in the lion's den. So as we're reading, and if we spend a lot of time reading, we would start to notice some of these characteristics. We would start to see, oh, chapter 3 and chapter 6 kind of read the same. This is on purpose. The author is linking, is paralleling, even though they don't follow each other, he's paralleling these two parts of the story. Chapter 7, Daniel has a vision of 4 beasts. So Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that Daniel interprets with the 4 kingdoms. Daniel in chapter 7 has a dream of 4 beasts or 4 kingdoms. Okay, now we'll get to 8 through 12, but I just wanted to show you the first part of the book. Now let's get to my last little bit about structure. And here we need to get the historical setting. So let's go to 2 Kings 23, 36 and following. It should be, yeah. So 36. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he ruled for 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zebidah. She was Pedaiah's daughter and was from Rumah. He did, that is Jehoiakim, did what was evil in the Lord's eyes, just as all his ancestors had done. In Jehoiakim's days, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon attacked. Jehoiakim had submitted to him for 3 years, but then Jehoiakim changed his mind and rebelled against him. And this sets in motion the first deportation of prominent Jewish people. Aristocracy, you might say, prominent people, leading citizens from Judah are carried away. That's what starts it. Now look at verse 7 of chapter 24. The Egyptian king never left his country again because the Babylonian king had taken over all the territory that had previously belonged to him. So there's backstory here where Egypt and Assyria go to battle against Babylon and they lose. So the Egyptian king goes home, the Egyptian empire is over. There's no more Egyptian interference in the land of Judah. Now Babylon controls that whole area. All right, Jeremiah 27, 19 and 20. This is what the Lord of heavenly forces, or the Lord of hosts, proclaims about the pillars, the sea, the stands, and the rest of the equipment left in this city, which Babylon's king Nebuchadnezzar didn't plunder when he deported Jeconiah, the son of Judah's king Jehoiakim, right? So Nebuchadnezzar leaves stuff, even though the temple gets torn down, he leaves stuff there, and there still is an attempt to obey the law by keeping the morning and evening sacrifices. If you go to the book of Leviticus, you'll see instructions about the morning and evening sacrifices. So there's still some kind of worship and community life at this point in the story. But Daniel, according to the book of Daniel, gets carried away to Babylonia during this period of time. All right, now, last bit of structure. again, it's just amazing how the writers are thinking out these things. And there's a reason they want to think them out and structure things this way. All right. Let's just, well, we probably don't have time to read Daniel 1, but if you keep it in front of you, you can see these verses and you scan while I summarize here. Now, I am following, as you can see there, a scholar named John Goldingay from his commentary on Daniel. So this is his work that I'm using. Let's look first at the numbers on the left. You see this is the chiastic structure that I've talked about before. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 3, there's 3, there's 3, there's 2, there's 1. And then we add in the letters, 1A, 2A. And then we add in another little thing. So there's, what he's trying to do is show the additional theme and then how subsequent themes mirror. There's a mirroring going on here. So 1A and 1B, look at that. At the beginning of the chapter, the Babylonians defeat Israel. At the end of the chapter, what does the last verse in Daniel 1 say?
We continued until the first year of Cyrus.
Okay, this seems so matter of fact, right? The way Goldingay puts it, he says, Daniel sees out the Babylonians. So it's like, okay, I'm still here, they're gone, right? Because now we're gonna get reference to the Persians, not immediately, but that last statement in chapter 1 about Daniel is still around when Cyrus shows up, when the Persians show up. So the Babylonians are gone. So they defeat Israel, but by the end of the chapter, there's a reference to they're not going to be around forever. Okay, 2a, the verses 3 through 7. These young men are taken for training. This we know from reading it. Now look at 2b. The young men, again, using his language, the young men are triumphant in the training. So there's a lot of story in between, but here we have themes. Okay, 3:1a. Daniel wants to avoid defilement, and then 3:2a takes on the test. Now we're moving toward the center of the chapter. And right away then, he's triumphant in that test and he avoids defilement. So wanting to avoid defilement and then avoiding defilement. The way the story is told sets these things in a kind of mirroring type structure. And then, as I pointed out, the other ones. So the chiastic structure wants us to look at what's emphasized in the middle. And the middle here is 3:2a and 3:2b. So verses 9 through 15, where the test is taken on and they are triumphant. So again, we're Jewish people living a long time ago, and we're listening to these stories about Daniel. God is faithful to protect Daniel and these young men from defilement. If they'll just stay faithful, God will protect them from defilement. It doesn't mean God will protect all of them from death or anything like that, but it does mean they will stay in right relationship with God. And that's a major theme in this book of Daniel. And so the structuring of chapter 1, which is a sort of introduction to the whole book, by way of telling this story, really has to do with God's sovereign faithfulness and the call of God's people to remain faithful, even though they're in difficult circumstances, trying circumstances. Now, there's a message that all of us need, right? We can remain faithful because God is faithful to us.
Steve, I have a
Okay.
historical question.
Yeah,
So we're talking about Judah, kingdom of Judah here with Jeremiah and Daniel both. What about Israel? Because he uses the word Israel there, but that's a separate kingdom. And they were taken by the Assyrians, is that correct?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the nation of Israel that's mentioned in the books of Kings is no more.
Right,
But of course, Israel as a reference goes way back to Jacob and earlier times. And so they do occasionally use Israel, that word, as a way of really referring to God's people as a whole.
yeah.
Yeah. But you're exactly right. The 10 northern tribes don't exist anymore.
And they were taken by the Assyrians.
That's correct. They were
Okay.
Does this- colonized by the Assyrians.
That predates Nebuchadnezzar, right?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
that happened in the 720s, 722 or 721. Yeah,
Okay,
good
thank
question.
you.
Okay, friends. I'm not gonna do this every week. This is a lot of information. I always kind of have this little fight with myself about how to do these kinds of things, but given the nature of this book, I thought I should try to introduce some of the scholarly questions about how to read this book, because it does mean later. I'm tipping my hand now. I'm not going to identify when the 70 weeks will end. We've got 62 weeks, we've got 70. I'm not going to try to figure out in history when they will end. But a lot of kind of end time scenario thinking wants to try to figure that out. We're not going to do that. So I may be disappointing some people, but we can talk about it. I'm glad to talk about it because we will get into some of those questions, but I'm not going to try to identify all of that and make it all fit together nicely.
Well, our understanding of quantity numbers is totally different than this culture.
Right.
I mean, they
Yeah.
didn't have calculators, they didn't, so their numbers did not mean, a
Right.
dozen did not mean 12, for example. I mean, it could be, but.
And there's a lot of symbolic use of numbers. We use numbers in exaggerated ways. Right? One of my favorites is, I told you 1,000,000 times not to exaggerate. Well, we know that, you know that I didn't really say that 1,000,000 times. So we kind of have little glimpses of the use of numbers in a certain way, but yeah, trying to make these things add up and fit together perfectly is just not going to be possible.
Well, that's not what it says.
Exactly. Okay, so more to come. We will see you next week.